Going back to everything you're saying, what is it that is, why are they demonizing animal-based products so much and then really wanting us to go even more plant-based than we essentially are, eating so much corn and soy?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with food subsidies and
Right.
how you can produce so much corn and soy so cheaply. So it makes sense then to incorporate that as a cheap food source. But a lot of my research has really looked at how the vested interests, and in particular Coca-Cola, which I believe is a huge influencer in dietary guidelines and health guidelines. The vice president for Coca-Cola, a guy called Alex Malaspina, started the International Life Sciences Institute, ILSI, in 1978. And this group includes everything from food industries to chemical industries, and it's got Monsanto and Bayer and all of those things on there as well. But it's Pfizer and Sanofi, so all the pharmaceutical industries. It started out with tobacco, but the tobacco industry then started to hide itself under craft and other food industries that they also bought, so they wouldn't seem so obviously tobacco. But Coca-Cola instigated that. And Coca-Cola, it was hugely instrumental in the Nutrition Foundation in America to begin with, and their Nutrition Reviews magazine that they produced then became part of the ILSI. So ILSI now print it. And this is, I would say, hugely influenced by food and pharmaceutical industries. And they are producing information for health professionals worldwide that subscribe to the ILSI and these nutrition reviews. So if you look at Coca-Cola, and I would say that it really covers a lot of the food industry, their intent, their public health messaging is to minimize the harms of sugar. And then I've come across the religious ideology that I believe is hugely influencing food and dietary guidelines and policy in all sorts of ways. And that's coming from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And their intent on promoting a biblical Garden of Eden diet, which is fruit, nuts, and seeds. And somehow these two have come together to create like a bit of a symbiotic relationship. And both of them, by minimizing the harms of sugar and promoting the Garden of Eden diet, they both want to demonize animal proteins and fats. It suits both parties to do that, which then allows them to promote a plant-based diet. And so you've got the industry, which has got conflicts of interest, and you've got a religion that has no conflicts of interest. It's got a purpose. Mm. And these two are very, very powerful allies that have been working together since the 1940s. And it makes no sense if you think about them as separate entities. I can't understand why they're working together. So it must just be that they really do want to work together because their purpose becomes highlighted in the final messaging, I guess. And so I'm not anti-vegan, I'm not anti-vegetarian, I'm not anti-religion. I think everyone has the right to their own beliefs and to be supported. In fact, Gary and I opened a nutrition clinic in 2014, and we supported everybody, no matter what their belief or their food preferences were. And I think that's really important going forward for people, because not everyone can eat a certain way and not everyone wants to eat meat. Right. But for what I'm seeing with these guidelines that are being created by these two very powerful groups is the demonization of animal proteins and fats. And that choice to eat those things is being taken away by these guidelines that are being shaped, and understanding that the dietary guidelines influence, some people think, oh, my dietary guidelines don't matter to me. I walk into a supermarket or I walk to the markets and I buy what I want to buy. But they are hugely influential in medical and dietetic education, school education, school lunch programs, what's fed in hospitals, what's fed in aged care and childcare, and prisons and military. Like, they do have a deep extending arm into all of these areas. And the current White House conference on, is it hunger, nutrition and health, coming up on Wednesday, that's going to try and make the dietary guidelines extend even further, really deeply into medical education. And I'm very, very concerned for, I guess, this embedding of a plant-based ideology into the fabric of American society. The more I look at it, the more I go, wow. And unfortunately, we follow you. So this is why I'm so interested in doing research into this area, because it will affect what happens here in Australia as well. And understanding the global influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on diet, which was a title of a research paper that was put out by devout Seventh-day Adventists. So I didn't make that title up. You know, understanding their global influence is massive. And you can look that up. I think it was published in 2017. They state in this paper that they believe nutrition science began with the advent of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1863 from visions that were given to their prophetess about health and food. She claimed they were given to her by God. And some people say, well, how does a little church really affect me? But they are one of the biggest healthcare providers in America. They have something like 84 hospitals based across America and a lot of clinics and other things, but they also have educational facilities. They train people in medicine and dietetics. And one of the founders of the American Dietetic Association was actually trained at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was originally owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church and under John Harvey Kellogg. And so this push, she took that into the American Dietetic Association in 1917, and she trained 500 dietitians herself personally in this promoting a plant-based diet. And she wrote the textbooks for over 30 years for dietetics. So it goes right back in history. Right. And this push has come further and further, and as I say, really cemented in the 1940s when Mervyn Harding from the College of Medical Evangelists went and did his PhD thesis under Frederick Stair at the Harvard School of Public Health. And this is when the vegan, imagine Fred Stair's utmost joy and surprise when someone who has no commercial vested interests comes and says, I want to prove that vegetarianism is healthy. And he's being paid by the food industry to promote cereals and grains. And you think, wow, he must have just gone, thank you very much. And they started publishing their papers in the early 1950s, presenting at Congress. And, this messaging has just grown from there. And this collaboration between, it's now called Loma Linda University and Harvard University, has cemented in many, many ways and is very strong right now.
I have so many questions, but
I know. I'm sorry. I know. I jump around so much.
No, it's good. That history is so powerful. I guess I just didn't know a lot about that history. I think the question I have, and maybe it's because Coca-Cola owns so much more of the food industry that I'm aware of, but yes, I would think that if I could why couldn't Coca-Cola be part of a meal that has a hamburger in it? And maybe it's because they own other parts, and so they want you to eat the plant-based burger. I'm not entirely sure. And then in terms of if the Seventh Day reads the Bible, for example, there are so many stories where in celebration, they kill the fattest animal and they celebrate with that. So are they picking and choosing religion? And I just don't know enough. So just curious your thoughts.
It's a really interesting conversation. I think if you go back to the 1800s, the temperance health reform movement was starting in America in the 1800s. It came from England, Swedenborgism, and a guy called William Metcalfe came to America to start the Bible Christian church. And he was a big believer, following on, right back to Pythagoras and all sorts of things. He'd heard little bits about, I suppose, Christian asceticism. And spiritual purity was not eating an animal that could be animalistic. Their whole beliefs around the 1800s, it was a big revivalistic movement, and they wanted to talk about calming and spiritual asceticism, and they believed in the early 1800s that taking flesh meat out of the diet would make people more spiritual. And a big belief was that spiritual purity was defiled by masturbation. So it was a really big concern back then, apparently. And I spoke to James Connolly recently. He worked on Sacred Cow with Diana Rogers. Oh, right. And he was saying to me, maybe they were looking at people in the prison system and in the hospitals who were considered insane and create, really criminal types, people with epilepsy. They looked at all sorts of people who were in these systems, and because they had nothing else to do, maybe they were masturbating. And then they turned that around and said that was the cause of their insanity. And that was the cause of their criminal behavior. Just trying to think, how did this become such a huge association with meat, masturbating and insanity and crime? So it came from then. And Sylvester Graham, you may have heard of Graham crackers. Sylvester Graham, Caleb Jackson, there was a lot of people in this temperance health reform movement before the Seventh-day Adventist Church was formed.
Wow.
But it led into that. And while these people were, so Sylvester Graham was, preaching on corners of the street, telling people they should be eating a bland diet and getting rid of all these animalistic thoughts. So in 1863, Ellen G. White, well, that was the year that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was founded, and she claimed that God was telling her that flesh meat was a toxic stimulant, and it was more harmful than alcohol or tobacco, all of these things. And so she took this temperance health reform belief to a church doctrine, and it became, this thing. I would say that they were all pushing towards a vegan diet, but in the 1800s, they didn't have the supplementation. They couldn't take all of the animal products out of the diet, and that goes all the way back to Pythagoras and the beginning of vegetarianism, because vitamin B12 is an essential nutrient, and it can only be found in animal proteins and fats. So while they were pushing towards getting rid of all animal products out of the diet, taking flesh meat out, they could do and still eat eggs and still have milk and still have cream and cheese and butter. So it was a vegetarian diet, but they were pushing and they wanted to get further. Veganism wasn't coined until 1944, and that's because by then they'd created supplementation, they'd fortified, they were doing all these things. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg was only 12 years old when he went to work for the first family of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, when he went to work with Ellen G. White and her husband James, and he was tasked with typesetting I would say her sermons. She calls them testimonies to the church. They were the visions that she was getting. She claimed to have received over 2,000 visions and dreams from God in her lifetime. And so she was writing books. I think she had 49 books in her lifetime. She's the most translated author in America of either gender.
Wow.
Like, people don't even understand how huge her writings are. They go globally, but this is someone who's very, very influential, who most people have never heard of.
Right.
And the book that he first typeset was called A Solemn Appeal to Mothers, or A Solemn Appeal. And it spoke only of mothers deterring their children from masturbating. And he was 12. He was typesetting things that, were saying things like, it was as if you put a pistol to your chest and took your life instantly. Your head decays inwardly. You become criminal. You become insane. You get epilepsy. You lose your eyesight. Well, hasn't everyone heard masturbating makes you go blind? I mean, even I've vaguely heard of that. She said all of these things in this book, and he worked and typeset for them for 4 years. They then paid for him to become a doctor. They paid for his medical education. So when he came back to work at their Western Health Reform Institute in the 1870s, and then he became the superintendent, he changed it to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and he grew it from a place that had maybe 40 people coming to the sanatoriums where they used to sit out and have like a lot of their beliefs, a lot of their thoughts around health make a lot of sense and were being talked about that by these temperance health reformers. Again, sunshine, rest, sleep, fresh air, all of those bits. Water cures were very big back then, but John Harvey Kellogg determined that maybe this defiling of people and to become totally spiritual, you had to have a clean colon. So he took it even further than anti-flesh meat. He organised people to have enemas all the time and just, eat very high fibre foods so that everything would just go through. So you wouldn't have any sensations down below to irritate, to potentially then make you want to masturbate. And this was honestly the belief and the basis of this dietary reform, which I think comes as a surprise to a lot of people. In fact, I've seen a heading that Kellogg's cornflakes were part of an anti-masturbation crusade. And people will think, oh, wow, but it grabs your attention. And when you look back, it actually, that's the truth. So right. It's a fascinating history as to where that came from. And William Keith Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg's brother, was his accountant and did a lot of work with him. John Harvey Kellogg married, and his wife had come from a home economics Ella Eaton Kellogg, she came from a home economics sort of background. And I don't know if you did it at school, but we actually had a class called home economics. But in home economics, we learned to cook and sew.
Right.
We didn't learn economics. Home economics started as an economic consideration of the cost of food. And so she brought that area in, and she created the dietetic education. I believe she was one of the founders of dietetics with John Harvey Kellogg. But they also created science in the kitchen and started doing experiments on how can they create foods that could take the place of flesh meat, milk, eggs, and butter. And that was their whole, I guess, their purpose in life. And William Keith just said to him, because all these cereal companies were all going off on the back of their inventions into flaked wheat and flaked corn. And William Keith said, we can make a lot of money from this. We need to add sugar. But John Harvey Kellogg was a very devout Adventist and very devout in his beliefs, and truly believed when Ellen G. White actually said, you shouldn't have a lot of sugar. So, and he didn't want to commercialize it. So they split off, and William Keith created the cereal empire we all know today as a very devout Adventist as well. But John Harvey Kellogg went on then to just keep experimenting to create alternative meats, alternative nut butters, all of those things. He held 30 plus patents for foods and food processes by the time he died.